Ethan thought he had the perfect life, a stable career, a loving marriage, and a bright future ahead. But everything changes when he discovers unsettling secrets about his wife, Sarah. What starts as subtle changes in her behavior spirals into a shocking betrayal that leaves Ethan questioning everything he believed in. Determined to uncover the truth, Ethan embarks on a journey of discovery, confronting lies, betrayal, and an explosive secret that threatens to unravel not just his marriage but everything he holds dear. How will Ethan navigate the storm? And what will he uncover along the way? Watch to find out. Every love story begins with hope, a sense of magic, and a promise of forever. For Ethan and Sarah, it was no different. Their story started in 2012, in a small town nestled in the heart of Colorado. Surrounded by sprawling mountain ranges and crisp, clean air, the town of Brookhaven was where they had built their life together. Ethan was a practical, hard-working man in his early 30s. He worked as a project manager for a local construction company and took pride in providing for his family. He was the kind of person who enjoyed fixing things, whether it was a squeaky door hinge or a strained relationship. His upbringing in a modest household instilled in him a strong sense of responsibility. Sarah, on the other hand, had a creative spark that balanced Ethan's pragmatism. She worked as a graphic designer, freelancing for small businesses and non-profits. She had an eye for beauty in the everyday. From the colors of the autumn leaves to the perfect cup of coffee, Sarah was warm, thoughtful, and had a way of lighting up a room. Together, they seemed like the perfect pair. Their home in Brookhaven was a reflection of their shared dreams, a quaint 2-story house with a garden. Sarah tended lovingly. Their dog, Max, was often seen lounging in the sunlit backyard. To outsiders, they appeared to have it all: a stable life, a loving marriage, and a future full of promise. But as is often the case, appearances can be deceiving. It wasn't that their marriage was inherently flawed. Like many couples, they had their ups and downs. After 8 years together, some of the initial spark had faded, but their bond felt solid, at least to Ethan. Things began to shift in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Ethan first noticed it one evening, when Sarah came home later than usual from a client meeting. She seemed distracted, her responses short and curt. When he asked about her day, she waved him off with a tired smile, saying she was just stressed from work. Ethan didn't think much of it at first. Work could be demanding, and Sarah had always taken her projects seriously. But over the next few weeks, her behavior grew more erratic. She started spending more time on her phone, texting late into the night with a smile she didn't explain. Her freelance projects became excuses for longer absences, and when Ethan offered to join her at a client's event, she quickly declined, saying it wasn't necessary. Sarah wasn't the only one changing. Ethan, too, was grappling with his own challenges. A major project at work had been delayed, putting him under immense pressure. The stress made him irritable, and he knew he hadn't been as attentive to Sarah as he should have been, but he still tried. He planned a surprise weekend getaway for their anniversary, hoping it would help them reconnect. When he presented the idea, Sarah hesitated before agreeing, her enthusiasm muted. Ethan brushed it off, telling himself she was just preoccupied with work. The getaway itself was pleasant, but lacked the warmth he had hoped for. Sarah seemed present in body but distant in spirit, as if her thoughts were elsewhere. Ethan chalked it up to the natural ebb and flow of long-term relationships. Every couple has rough patches, he reasoned, and theirs was no different. Things came to a head one night when Ethan came home earlier than expected from a late meeting. As he walked through the door, he heard Sarah's voice coming from the kitchen. She was on the phone, her tone softer and more animated than it had been with him in months. Ethan paused in the hallway, an uneasy feeling settling in his chest. He couldn't make out the words, but the sound of her laughter was both familiar and foreign. It reminded him of how she used to laugh with him. When Sarah ended the call and noticed Ethan standing there. She seemed startled. "You're home early," she said, her voice tinged with surprise. "Meeting ended sooner than expected," Ethan replied, studying her expression. "Who were you talking to?" Sarah hesitated for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for Ethan to notice. "Just a client," she said, brushing past him to grab her laptop. Ethan wanted to believe her, but a seed of doubt had been planted. Over the next few days, he found himself replaying that moment in his mind, questioning her behavior. One afternoon, while Sarah was out running errands, Ethan's curiosity got the better of him. He opened her laptop, something he had never felt the need to do before. It wasn't long before he found an email thread that made his stomach drop. The emails were between Sarah and someone named Mark, a fellow designer she had collaborated with on a recent project. At first, the messages seemed innocent, discussions about layouts and color schemes, but as Ethan scrolled further, the tone shifted. The exchanges became increasingly personal, filled with playful banter and inside jokes. Then came the messages that left no room for doubt. "I can't stop thinking about last night," Mark had written. "You looked amazing." Sarah's response was equally damning. "I wish we had more time together. It's getting harder to pretend nothing's going on." Ethan closed the laptop, his hands trembling. A rush of emotions flooded him: anger, disbelief, heartbreak. He had always trusted Sarah implicitly, never imagining she would betray him. But now, faced with undeniable proof, he realized he couldn't ignore the truth. He needed to confront her, but more importantly, he needed a plan. Ethan decided to bide his time, gathering more evidence and preparing himself for the conversation that would change everything. The man who had always believed in fixing things was now forced to confront a reality he never thought possible. Ethan spent the next few days in a haze, replaying everything he had found on Sarah's laptop. Each moment felt surreal, like waking up in the middle of a nightmare you couldn't escape. The weight of betrayal hung heavy on him, but amidst the chaos in his mind, one thing became clear. He needed to approach this carefully. He couldn't just confront Sarah outright, as much as he wanted to demand answers. He knew the situation required more finesse. He wanted to know the full extent of what was going on, and, more importantly, he needed to figure out what his next move would be. In the days that followed, Ethan began observing Sarah more closely. He noticed the little things he had once ignored, the way she always seemed to have her phone angled away from him. The late nights she claimed were for brainstorming. The lingering scent of cologne on her clothes, one he didn't recognize. But it wasn't just her actions that hurt. It was the growing distance between them. The once lively conversations over dinner had turned into hollow exchanges about mundane topics. Ethan felt like he was living with a stranger. In an effort to cope, Ethan confided in his best friend, Jake. They met up for drinks one evening at their favorite local bar. "You sure about this?" Jake asked, after Ethan shared what he'd discovered. "Positive," Ethan replied, his voice heavy with frustration. "I saw the emails. I know there's something going on." Jake shook his head, anger flickering in his eyes. "Man, that's rough. What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," Ethan admitted. "Part of me wants to confront her now, but I need more. If this goes to divorce, and it probably will, I don't want her twisting things around." Jake nodded in agreement. "Smart move. But don't let her walk all over you, Ethan. You deserve better than this." Hearing those words gave Ethan a small boost of confidence. For the first time in days, he felt a flicker of control over the situation. Back at home, Ethan began documenting everything. He took screenshots of the emails, noted Sarah's unusual behavior, and even started keeping a journal to log the moments that didn't sit right with him. It was a cold, calculated approach, but he knew it was necessary. Meanwhile, Sarah seemed blissfully unaware of Ethan's suspicions. If she noticed his distant demeanor, she didn't show it. In fact, She seemed more upbeat than she had in months, as if the weight of some unspoken burden had been lifted off her shoulders. The real turning point came one Friday evening. Sarah told Ethan she was heading out to meet a friend for drinks. She didn't offer many details, and Ethan didn't press her. He had other plans. After Sarah left, Ethan grabbed his jacket and headed out himself. He wasn't going to follow her blindly, but he had a hunch about where she might be. He remembered one of the emails mentioning a small, upscale lounge downtown, a place that Sarah had never mentioned before their marriage, but that now seemed to be a recurring topic of conversation between her and Mark. Sure enough, when Ethan arrived at the lounge, he spotted Sarah almost immediately. She was sitting in a cozy corner booth, laughing and leaning far too close to a man Ethan recognized from a photo on her laptop, Mark. Ethan's chest tightened as he watched them. He wanted to march over there, to call her out in front of everyone, but he held himself back. He needed to play this smart. He pulled out his phone and snapped a few photos, careful to remain out of sight. The images were clear, Sarah and Mark together, their body language unmistakable. Ethan didn't stay long. He had seen enough to confirm his suspicions. As he drove home, a mix of emotions churned inside him: anger, heartbreak, and a strange sense of relief. The truth was out, and now he could finally take action. When Sarah returned later that night, she acted as if nothing had happened. Ethan, however, couldn't bring himself to pretend. "You have fun tonight?" he asked, his tone neutral but probing. Sarah hesitated for a split second before replying, "Yeah, it was nice to catch up with Mia." Ethan nodded, masking his frustration. "Glad to hear it." The next morning, Ethan decided it was time to take the first step toward confronting Sarah. He called Jake for support, explaining his plan. Jake agreed to help, offering a listening ear and advice as Ethan navigated the murky waters ahead. Ethan also reached out to a divorce lawyer he had found online. He wanted to understand his options before making any drastic moves. During their initial consultation, the lawyer emphasized the importance of evidence and documentation. Ethan's meticulous record-keeping would serve him well. As the days went on, Ethan began to notice cracks in Sarah's facade. She became more secretive, more guarded. It was clear she sensed something was off, but she couldn't pinpoint what. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table, Ethan decided to test the waters. "Hey, Sarah," he began casually. "I've been thinking about us lately. Do you feel like we're in a good place?" Sarah looked up from her plate, startled by the question. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," Ethan said, feigning uncertainty. "You've seemed a little distant lately. I just want to make sure we're okay." Sarah's response was measured, almost rehearsed. "Work's been stressful. That's all. I'm sorry if I've been distracted." Ethan nodded, pretending to accept her explanation. But deep down, he knew it was just another lie. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place a week later. While Sarah was in the shower, Ethan saw a notification pop up on her phone, a message from Mark. He didn't hesitate. Picking up the phone, he unlocked it and scrolled through their conversation. The messages confirmed everything Ethan had suspected. Sarah and Mark were planning another rendezvous, this time at a hotel just outside of town. The details were all there: the time, the room number, even the excuse Sarah planned to give Ethan. Ethan's hands shook as he read the messages. The betrayal felt like a physical blow, but it also solidified his resolve. He now had everything he needed to confront her and to protect himself in the aftermath. At this point, Ethan knew he couldn't handle this alone. He reached out to Jake again, explaining the latest developments. Jake, ever the loyal friend, offered to help however he could. "You're doing the right thing, Ethan," Jake assured him. "Just stay calm and stick to your plan. You've got this." Ethan spent the next few days preparing for the confrontation. He gathered all his evidence: emails, photos, text messages, and made copies to ensure nothing would be lost. He rehearsed what he wanted to say, determined to approach the situation with clarity and composure. When the day finally came, Ethan felt a strange sense of calm. He had done everything he could to prepare, and now it was time to face the truth head-on. If this story has kept you hooked so far, don't forget to like, share, and comment your thoughts below. And if you want to hear more incredible tales like this, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on what happens next. Ethan decided the confrontation would take place the evening of Sarah's planned rendezvous with Mark. It wasn't just about catching her in the act, it was about reclaiming control over a life that had spiraled into deceit and mistrust. He spent the day meticulously setting the stage. He organized his evidence into neat folders, printed copies of the damning emails and photos, and prepared a calm but firm speech to deliver. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan's resolve hardened. He knew this night would change everything, but he also knew it was necessary. Sarah arrived home as usual, but there was an air of nervous energy about her. She barely met Ethan's eyes as she shuffled through the kitchen, claiming she was exhausted from a long day. "I'm just going to lie down for a bit," she said, her voice unusually soft. Ethan nodded, keeping his emotions in check. "Sure, let me know if you need anything." He watched her retreat upstairs, knowing full well that she was preparing for her night with Mark. An hour later, Sarah reappeared, dressed more sharply than usual for a casual outing. She claimed she was meeting Mia again, throwing in a half-hearted excuse about needing some girl time to decompress. Ethan suppressed a bitter laugh. He'd heard enough lies for a lifetime. "Have fun," he said, his tone neutral. As soon as Sarah left, Ethan followed her at a safe distance. His heart pounded in his chest, but his determination kept him focused. She drove to the same hotel where she and Mark had met, before Ethan parked discreetly across the street, waiting for the perfect moment to act. From his vantage point, he saw her greet Mark in the lobby with a hug that lingered far too long. Together, they checked in and disappeared into the elevator. Ethan snapped a few photos for good measure, his jaw clenched tightly. He waited 20 minutes before walking into the hotel himself. Armed with the room number from their text conversation, he approached the front desk and flashed a friendly smile. "I'm here to surprise my wife," he said, holding up a photo of Sarah on his phone. "Can you let me know which room she's in?" The receptionist hesitated for a moment before confirming the room number. Ethan thanked her and headed toward the elevator. His pulse quickened as he approached the room. He knocked twice, his knuckles firm against the wood. There was a pause, then the muffled sound of voices. The door opened slightly, and Mark's face appeared, his expression quickly shifting from confusion to panic. "Can I help you?" Mark stammered. "I think you already have," Ethan said coldly, pushing the door open. Inside, Sarah was sitting on the edge of the bed, her face frozen in shock. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan stepped into the room, his eyes blazing with controlled anger. "Don't stop on my account. I wouldn't want to interrupt whatever this is." Mark backed away, raising his hands defensively. "Look, man, I didn't know—" "Save it," Ethan snapped, cutting him off. "I'm not here to argue with you. This is between me and my wife." Sarah's cheeks flushed with shame as she struggled to find words. "Ethan, I can explain—" "Explain?" Ethan interrupted, his voice rising. "Explain what? That you've been lying to me for months? That you threw away our marriage for this?" Sarah stood up, tears welling in her eyes. "It's not what you think." "It's exactly what I think," Ethan shot back. "And I have the proof to back it up. Emails, texts, photos. Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" Mark, sensing the weight of the confrontation, grabbed his coat and moved toward the door. "I think I'll leave you two to talk." "You do that," Ethan said, glaring at him. "And don't think for a second that I won't be letting your employer know about this. I'm sure they'll love hearing how you spend your off hours. Mark hesitated, but ultimately decided it wasn't worth the risk. He slipped out of the room without another word, leaving Ethan and Sarah alone. For a moment, the room was silent, except for the sound of Sarah's quiet sobs. Ethan crossed his arms, his gaze unwavering. "Why, Sarah?" he finally asked, his voice softer but no less pained. "Why did you do this to us?" Sarah wiped her tears, struggling to compose herself. "I don't know," she admitted. "I felt lost, unappreciated, like we were just going through the motions." "Unappreciated," Ethan repeated, incredulous. "Do you have any idea how hard I've worked to make our life together stable, to give you everything you wanted?" "I know," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "But somewhere along the way, I felt like we lost each other. I didn't know how to fix it." "So your solution was to cheat?" Ethan said, his anger flaring again. "To betray me with someone you barely know?" Sarah looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way." "But it did," Ethan said firmly. "And now, there's no going back." Sarah's head snapped up, panic flashing in her eyes. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying it's over," Ethan said, his voice resolute. "I'm filing for divorce. You made your choice, Sarah. Now I'm making mine." Sarah broke down, pleading with him to reconsider. But Ethan had already made up his mind. He walked out of the hotel room, leaving her sobbing in his wake. When Ethan returned home, he felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and a newfound sense of clarity. The chapter with Sarah was over, but his story was far from finished. Ethan knew walking out of that hotel room was only the beginning of what lay ahead. As much as he wanted to be done with Sarah and everything she had done to him, the fallout from their confrontation was bound to ripple through every part of his life. He wasn't just ending a marriage. He was dismantling years of shared history, mutual friends, and intertwined routines. The next morning, Ethan woke early and contacted his lawyer, determined to set the divorce process in motion. His lawyer, a calm and methodical woman named Andrea, was impressed with the thoroughness of Ethan's evidence. "This is solid," Andrea told him during their call. "It's clear, documented, and leaves little room for dispute. With this, you'll have a strong case for an uncontested divorce." Ethan thanked her, feeling a sense of reassurance that at least one part of this ordeal might be straightforward. Meanwhile, Sarah was unraveling. She had returned home later that night after Ethan left her in the hotel room, her face streaked with tears, and her voice hoarse from crying. Ethan hadn't spoken to her. He simply stayed in the guest room, locking the door to make it clear that there was no room for discussion. The next day, Sarah tried everything to reach him. Texts, calls, even notes left outside the guest room door, but Ethan remained unresponsive. "You can't ignore me forever, Ethan," she pleaded through the door. "Watch me," he replied curtly. The tension between them was suffocating. Sarah was desperate to explain herself, to justify what she had done, but Ethan's silence was unyielding. It wasn't until 3 days later, when Andrea finalized the divorce papers, that Ethan finally sat down with Sarah to deliver the news. "You're divorcing me?" she asked, her voice trembling as she read through the papers. "You left me no choice," Ethan said, his tone firm but controlled. "This isn't about punishing you, Sarah. It's about moving on. You made your decision, and now I'm making mine." Sarah's hands shook as she set the papers down. "I made a mistake, Ethan, a terrible mistake, but we can work through this. We can go to counseling, figure out what went wrong." Ethan cut her off. "You didn't just make a mistake, Sarah. You made a series of choices, calculated, deliberate choices, to betray me. Counseling won't fix what you've broken." Sarah's tears fell freely, but Ethan remained resolute. He knew this was the right path, no matter how difficult it was to stay on it. As the divorce process moved forward, Ethan's life became a whirlwind of emotions and logistics. He worked tirelessly to manage his business, keep his personal life intact, and prepare for a future without Sarah. During this time, Ethan found solace in an unexpected place. Jake, his best friend, introduced him to a local hiking group. The group met weekly to explore the rugged trails around Brookhaven, offering Ethan a much-needed escape from the turmoil of his personal life. On one of these hikes, Ethan met Claire, a soft-spoken but spirited woman, who had recently moved to the area. Claire was a wildlife photographer with a quick wit and a kind heart, and she quickly became a bright spot in Ethan's otherwise dark days. At first, their connection was purely platonic. Ethan wasn't ready to consider another relationship, and Claire respected his boundaries. But as the weeks passed, their conversations grew deeper, their laughter more frequent. Claire's presence reminded Ethan of something he had nearly forgotten, what it felt like to be seen, valued, and appreciated for who he was. Meanwhile, Sarah's life was unraveling. The affair with Mark had come to an abrupt end after their exposure, and she found herself isolated and overwhelmed by regret. Her friends, many of whom were mutual acquaintances of Ethan, had distanced themselves from her. Even her family was critical of her actions, offering little in the way of support. One evening, Sarah showed up unannounced at Ethan's door, her face pale and drawn. "Ethan, please," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to hear me out." Ethan hesitated before stepping aside to let her in. He wasn't sure why he agreed. Perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps he simply needed closure. "I don't expect us to go back to the way things were," Sarah began, her eyes brimming with tears. "But I need you to know that I regret everything. I hate myself for what I did to you. To us, I was selfish, and I ruined the best thing I ever had." Ethan listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he took a deep breath and spoke. "I appreciate you saying that, Sarah," he said, "but regret doesn't change what happened. It doesn't erase the lies, the betrayal, or the pain you caused." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know I wanted you to know that I'll always love you, even if I don't deserve your love in return." Ethan's heart ached at her words, but he stood firm. "Love isn't just a feeling, Sarah. It's a choice, and you chose to walk away from it." As Sarah left that night, Ethan felt a sense of finality wash over him. He had done everything he could to save their marriage, but he knew now that letting go was the only path forward. Ethan's life began to take on a new rhythm. He continued to grow his business, finding fulfillment in the work he once took for granted. His friendship with Claire deepened, and while he was cautious about rushing into anything, he couldn't deny the spark that had ignited between them. One evening, as they sat together on a hill overlooking Brookhaven, Claire turned to Ethan with a thoughtful expression. "You've been through so much," she said softly. "But you're still standing. That's something to be proud of." Ethan smiled, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I guess I've learned that sometimes the only way to move forward is to let go of what's holding you back." The road to healing wasn't easy, but Ethan had finally found his footing. And as he looked toward the future, he knew that the storm that had once threatened to consume him had only made him stronger. Ethan had thought that filing for divorce and confronting Sarah was the hardest part of his ordeal, but the emotional fallout was just beginning. He wasn't angry anymore. Not the searing, overwhelming anger that had driven him to expose Sarah's betrayal. Now, he felt a quieter, heavier kind of sorrow. The life he had spent years building was gone, and he had to pick up the pieces while trying to figure out what came next. Sarah, however, wasn't ready to let go. Even after signing the divorce papers, she clung to the hope that Ethan might forgive her. She sent him messages late at night, long-winded apologies filled with regret and promises to change. She even reached out to mutual friends, trying to rally them to her side, but her attempts only deepened the divide between them. Ethan stayed firm. He responded to her messages sparingly, keeping the conversation civil but distant. He wasn't cruel, but he made it clear that he had no interest in rekindling what they'd lost. Despite his best efforts to move forward, there were moments that tested his resolve. One of those moments came when Sarah's parents, whom Ethan had always gotten along with, asked to meet him for coffee. "They're probably just trying to smooth things over," Jake warned when Ethan told him about the invitation. "Be careful. They might try to guilt you into giving her another chance." Ethan shrugged. "I'll hear them out, I owe them that much." When he met them at the cafe, Sarah's parents looked uncomfortable, almost as if they didn't know how to begin. "Ethan, we just want to say how sorry we are for everything," Sarah's mother said, her voice wavering. "We had no idea what was going on, and if we'd known, we would have told her to stop before it got this far." Sarah's father chimed in. "She's a mess without you, Ethan. She knows she screwed up, and she wants to make things right." Ethan sighed, feeling a pang of sympathy for them. They were good people, and it wasn't their fault that their daughter had made the choices she did. "I appreciate you reaching out," Ethan said carefully, "but this isn't something that can be fixed. Sarah made her choices, and I have to live with the consequences of that, so does she." They nodded reluctantly, sensing that Ethan's mind was made up. As they parted ways, Ethan felt a strange mix of emotions: gratitude for their kindness, guilt for the pain Sarah's actions had caused them, and relief that he had stood his ground. Meanwhile, Ethan's friendship with Claire continued to grow. They saw each other often, whether it was on group hikes or quiet evenings spent talking about everything and nothing. Claire had a calming presence that Ethan found comforting, and for the first time in months, he felt like he could breathe again. One evening, as they sat by the fire pit in Claire's backyard, she asked him a question that caught him off guard. "Do you ever think about what you want next, not just in relationships, but in life?" Ethan stared into the flames, considering her words. "Honestly, I haven't thought that far ahead. I've been so focused on getting through each day that I haven't had time to think about what's next." Claire nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "It's okay to take your time, but when you're ready, I hope you'll remember that you deserve something good, something real." Her words stuck with him long after their conversation ended. As the weeks turned into months, Ethan began to rebuild his life piece by piece. His business flourished, bolstered by new clients who appreciated his attention to detail and reliability. He poured his energy into his work, finding satisfaction in each completed project. But it wasn't just work that gave him purpose. Ethan started volunteering at a local community center, mentoring young adults who were navigating their own challenges. It was a way for him to give back, to take what he had learned from his struggles and use it to help others. Through it all, Sarah remained a shadow in the background of his life. They rarely spoke, except when necessary to finalize the details of their divorce. Ethan heard through mutual acquaintances that she was trying to move on, but he didn't dwell on it. The turning point came on a brisk autumn afternoon, almost a year after Ethan had walked out of that hotel room. He was hiking alone, following a trail that wound through a dense forest of golden leaves. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the crunch of his boots on the path and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. As he reached the summit of the trail, he paused to take in the view. A sweeping panorama of the town below, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan felt at peace. He wasn't thinking about Sarah, or the pain she had caused, or the future he had once envisioned for them. He was simply present, grounded in the moment. It was then that he realized something profound. He had survived. The storm that had upended his life hadn't broken him. It had made him stronger, more resilient, and more attuned to what truly mattered. Later that evening, as he shared a quiet dinner with Claire, Ethan found himself smiling more easily, laughing more freely. He didn't know where their friendship might lead, but he was content to let it unfold naturally. "You seem different," Claire said, tilting her head as she studied him. "Different how?" Ethan asked. "Lighter," she replied with a smile, "like you finally let go of something heavy." Ethan nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "Maybe I have." As they clinked glasses and continued their conversation, Ethan felt a sense of gratitude he hadn't felt in a long time. Sometimes, the hardest journeys lead to the most rewarding destinations. And for Ethan, the journey was far from over. But for the first time, he was excited to see where it would take him. The tension between Ethan and Sarah reached its boiling point as the final stages of their divorce neared. Despite Ethan's clarity about their separation, Sarah clung to the hope that he might change his mind. Her persistent messages became more desperate, veering between pleas for forgiveness and veiled threats about how their lives would change once the divorce was finalized. For Ethan, the closer they came to severing ties, the more he felt the weight of their shared history pressing down on him. He couldn't forget the good years they had shared before everything fell apart, but those memories weren't enough to undo the damage Sarah had caused. The final court hearing was set for a cold morning in December. Ethan arrived early, his breath visible in the frigid air as he stepped into the courthouse. He had prepared himself for this day, knowing it would be a turning point in his life. Sarah arrived shortly after, accompanied by her lawyer. She looked anxious, her usual confidence replaced by a nervous energy that seemed to radiate from her every move. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense but quiet. The judge reviewed the case with a detached professionalism that Ethan found oddly reassuring. Andrea, his lawyer, presented their side with precision, leaving little room for debate. When the judge declared the marriage dissolved, Ethan felt an unexpected mix of relief and sadness. The chapter was officially closed, but the emotional weight of what had been lost lingered. As they exited the courtroom, Sarah caught up to Ethan in the hallway. "Ethan, wait," she said, her voice trembling. He stopped, turning to face her. "Is this really it?" she asked, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "After everything we've been through, this is how it ends?" Ethan hesitated, searching for the right words. "It ended a long time ago. Sarah today just made it official." She nodded slowly, her expression crumbling as she realized there was nothing left to say. Without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving Ethan standing alone in the hallway. The divorce marked a turning point for Ethan, but it wasn't the climax of his journey. That came weeks later, when he received an unexpected phone call. It was from Natalie, the wife of Sarah's former lover. Mark Ethan had almost forgotten about her in the chaos of the divorce, but hearing her voice brought a flood of memories rushing back. "Natalie?" he said, surprised. "What can I do for you?" "I think it's more about what I can do for you," she replied, her tone sharp and focused. Natalie went on to explain that Mark had recently confessed to his affair with Sarah, and the fallout from their confrontation had been explosive. But what caught Ethan's attention was Natalie's revelation that Mark had been embezzling funds from the company they both worked for, a detail that directly involved Sarah. "I don't know how much she knew, but I thought you should hear it from me," Natalie said. "If there's anything I can do to help, let me know." Ethan thanked her, his mind racing as he processed the implications of her words. If Sarah had been complicit in Mark's schemes, it could mean legal trouble for her, and an opportunity for Ethan to finally reclaim the sense of justice he'd been denied. He reached out to Andrea, sharing everything Natalie had told him. Andrea, ever the strategist, advised him to proceed carefully. "This could open a can of worms," she warned. "But if it's true, it might explain some of Sarah's actions during your marriage." Ethan decided to dig deeper. With Natalie's help, he gathered evidence of Mark's financial misconduct and Sarah's potential involvement. What he uncovered was shocking. Sarah hadn't just been an unwitting participant. She had actively helped Mark cover his tracks, using her graphic design skills to forge documents that masked the missing funds. Ethan felt a surge of anger as he pieced everything together. Not only had Sarah betrayed him emotionally, but she had also jeopardized her integrity for a man who ultimately discarded her. The climax came when Ethan, armed with the evidence, confronted Sarah one final time. He didn't want revenge. He simply wanted the truth. When he arrived at her apartment, she opened the door with a mixture of surprise and apprehension. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice cautious. "We need to talk," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. He placed the folder of evidence on her kitchen table, his expression grim. "Explain this." Sarah's face paled as she flipped through the documents. She tried to deny her involvement at first, but Ethan's persistence left her with nowhere to hide. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mark said it was just a temporary fix, that no one would get hurt." "No one would get hurt?" Ethan repeated, his voice rising. "You didn't think about the people who trusted you, or about what this would do to your own life?" Sarah broke down, her defenses crumbling under the weight of her guilt. "I didn't know how to stop it, Ethan. By the time I realized what I'd gotten myself into, it was too late." Ethan shook his head, a mixture of pity and frustration washing over him. "You didn't just hurt yourself, Sarah. You hurt me, your family, everyone who believed in you. And for what, a man who didn't even respect you enough to stay?" Sarah couldn't answer. Her sobs filled the silence between them, but Ethan felt no satisfaction in her pain. "I'm not here to punish you," he said finally. "That's not my job, but you need to take responsibility for what you've done." As he left her apartment, Ethan felt a strange sense of closure. He had faced the truth, confronted the person who had hurt him most, and come out on the other side stronger than he ever thought possible. It wasn't the ending he had envisioned for his marriage, but it was the ending he needed to move forward. Ethan left Sarah's apartment with a sense of finality he hadn't felt in months. The confrontation had been draining, but it also brought a strange sense of peace. For the first time, he felt like the weight of the past was finally lifting off his shoulders. As he drove home, Ethan thought about the man he had been when he first married Sarah. Optimistic, trusting, and perhaps a little naive. That version of himself was long gone, replaced by someone who had weathered the storm of betrayal and come out stronger on the other side. The weeks following their final confrontation passed quickly. The evidence Ethan and Natalie had uncovered led to Mark's arrest for embezzlement. Sarah's role in the scheme was exposed, but with Andrea's advice, Ethan chose not to involve himself further. He had done his part, and it was now up to Sarah to face the consequences of her actions. Ethan's life, however, was on an entirely different trajectory. His business continued to thrive, and he found joy in the small, steady victories that came with building something of his own. One crisp spring morning, Ethan met Claire at their favorite hiking trail. Over the past year, their friendship had blossomed into something more, though they were both cautious about moving too fast. As they walked along the familiar path, the sunlight filtering through the trees, Ethan couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. "You seem lighter," Claire said, glancing at him with a smile. Ethan chuckled. "You said that before." "Yeah, but now it's different. You're not just surviving anymore, Ethan. You're living." He paused, considering her words. "I think you're right. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm not just looking back. I'm looking forward." Claire's smile widened, and she reached for his hand. "So, what's next for you?" Ethan squeezed her hand gently, a quiet confidence in his voice. "Whatever comes, I'm ready for it." Their relationship grew stronger. With each passing month, Claire's patience and kindness reminded Ethan of the kind of love he wanted, one built on trust, respect, and mutual support. Meanwhile, Sarah's life had taken a stark turn. The fallout from her involvement with Mark left her alienated from many of her friends and colleagues. Ethan heard through mutual acquaintances that she was working to rebuild her life, but he no longer felt the need to keep tabs on her. She was a part of his past, and he was firmly focused on his future. 1 year after the divorce was finalized, Ethan found himself back on the same hill where he had watched the sunset and realized he was ready to move on. This time, he wasn't alone. Claire stood beside him, her camera slung over her shoulder as they admired the view. "You know," Ethan said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I used to come up here to clear my head when things got overwhelming. Now it just feels peaceful." Claire glanced at him, her expression soft. "That's because you found your peace, Ethan, and you've earned it." Ethan nodded, his heart full. The pain and betrayal he had endured were now distant memories, replaced by the strength and resilience he had gained along the way. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan felt a quiet sense of closure. He didn't need to look back anymore. His life was his own again, and the possibilities ahead were endless. And that's how Ethan turned his darkest moments into a journey of self-discovery and growth. If you enjoyed this story of resilience and redemption, don't forget to like, share, and comment below. And if you want more incredible stories like this, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a single video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.